All right, well, it's 4 o'clock, so I think we should get started. Welcome, everybody. I want to welcome you to Open Access Week here at Cornell University. I'm Alison, and I'm the communications coordinator for arXiv.org, which is hosted here at Cornell. As you know, today's panel is all about the effect of the pandemic on open access resources. And as we all know, when the pandemic hit, researchers across disciplines and across the world rushed to study the virus, the disease, transmission, and treatment. And open access research sharing platforms, also known as preprint servers, provided the ideal format for scientists to share their findings quickly with their peers. So today we have 3 panelists who will share their perspectives on open access during this challenging time. We have Eleonora Presani, Executive Director of arXiv. We have John Inglis, co-founder of bioRxiv and medRxiv, and Sebastian Kohlmeier from Semantic Scholar. So I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists in turn to introduce yourselves and try to recall the early days of the pandemic. And I'd like to know what you were observing in the research world, what was the immediate impact on your organization, and how you responded. We'll start with Eleonora, and then we'll move on to John and then Sebastian.
Hi, thank you, Alison, and hello, everyone. So I started as executive director of arXiv. Actually, my first day was March 16. So that was basically the day of the lockdown, at least in New York State. So my experience in arXiv has been a clear parallel with the pandemic and with all the things that have happened since then. So I had the opportunity to really see how immediately as I joined, everyone had to change their way of working, changed the way we interact with our users, and also how the effects of the pandemic really applied to arXiv specifically. And that happened both from, and this is something that I will explain a little bit when I get the chance to show some slides, but basically both from a submission perspective, so we can see that people want to write more about their research related to COVID, but also from survival perspective from us as an organization and how we need to adjust our expectations and the way we work with our members and funders through this pandemic.
John?
Yes, thank you, Alison. And let me start by thanking the arXiv team for the invitation to do this. So I'm John Inglis. I'm a faculty member at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, which is about 30 miles east of New York City. It's 130 years old and it's well known as a research institution, but for a lot of its history, it has also been very much a place where people shared science and shared new results, either in person or through writing or multimedia. And now, so 7 years ago, I was a co-founder of bioRxiv, a preprint server for biology, which was very frankly inspired by the success of arXiv in its own communities. And like arXiv, bioRxiv is a not-for-profit service. It's not a publication or a product. And today we posted our 100,000th manuscript, which is something I find fairly astonishing. The submission rate continues to increase. It's currently around 3,500 papers a month. A couple of years after the launch of bioRxiv, there were calls from prominent physicians for something similar in medicine. And this prompted us to have a long conversation with doctors and medical editors and ethicists and so on about the benefits and the potential risks of a medical preprint server. And that culminated in the launch last year in June of medRxiv, which is a server for the health sciences. It is very much modeled on bioRxiv, and it's managed in a partnership with BMJ, the British Global Health Knowledge Provider, and Yale University. And in 15 months, it's accumulated 12,000 manuscripts. And how it got there is something I think we're going to talk about in a bit more detail, because the rise of medRxiv is very, very much a story of the rise of preprints relating to the pandemic.
Sebastian?
Yes. Hi, my name is Sebastian Kohlmeier. I'm the Senior Manager of Program Management and Partnerships Business Operations at the Allen Institute for AI. I work on a free academic search and discovery website called Semantic Scholar. Also excited to be here and thank the arXiv team for the invitation. At Semantic Scholar, our goal is to provide an academic search and discovery experience that enables users to find relevant research more quickly. As part of that, we partner with organizations like arXiv, bioRxiv, medRxiv to index scientific content from preprint servers, but we also partner with scientific publishers to build a corpus of research papers that's both searchable and explorable via different features on our website. One of the main things that happened in the early days of the pandemic is a lot of the work that we had been planning around partnerships. We were planning to attend the London Book Fair, and that was of course canceled. There was also a talk that we were going to give at the Open University to meet with CORE, which also very much focused on open access, and that was also canceled. So a lot of the work that sort of the business as usual work that we had planned was interrupted. But at the same time, there was an opportunity here, and John and Eleonora have already mentioned this in terms of making really doubling down and focusing on making research content openly available to address the pandemic. And I'll talk a little bit more detail about what we did there with creating a data set called COVID-19, but I won't get too far down the road there. I'll hand it back to you, Alison.
Thanks, Sebastian. Eleonora, do you want to give us a little bit more detail about what actually happened when all these papers started coming in? arXiv is not usually accustomed to papers in the category, in biology or medicine.
Right. Is that a good time for me to share some slides?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So then I'll share a little bit. Because indeed, what happened in arXiv during the time of COVID, I think it's an interesting case study by itself. Just to give an introduction about arXiv for those who are not completely familiar with it, we are a repository of preprints, so articles that have not yet been published to journals in general, and we have submissions from most of the countries in the world. So as you can see, while the great majority of our first authors, at least, are from the United States, there is certainly a distribution across the entire globe of authors, and we have a team of both staff and volunteers that are working to facilitating these submissions and their production online. So we have about 185 moderators, for example, and we have 7 advisory committees, 1 for each subject that we are covering. So this is to say that each subject that we are usually engaging with has its own group of people that are really working around it, and they're really making sure that everything works smoothly, that the quality of the articles that is published is enough to be, you know, basic trust from the researchers, and that yeah, everyone can find the information that they want in the right category and things like that. And we also work together, a group of members, so about 129 libraries and institutions around the world, plus 5 consortia that represent 125 additional libraries, are part of our community and support us, both helping us financially, but also just in terms of reach to the entire global community. So what happened in March was, so here on the left you see our submission rate by week. So the numbers below here is a number of week number, let's say, from January 1st. So in orange is the number of papers that we are always receiving, and then in blue here the number of papers related to COVID. And of course, if you look at this from this perspective, it's a very small fraction of papers, so it might seem almost insignificant. If you zoom in, of course, you see that basically out of nowhere we started to receive more than 100 papers per week. So we had to do something about it to ensure that we can process them with the same service level that we do for all the other papers that we receive. And I think that the fact that it's a small percentage, if you compare it with the total number of papers, it's true, but you have also to see that it changes by topic and by subject to subject. So for example, we have one category that is called quantitative biology, and the majority of COVID related paper came around that category. So for them, that is a small category for us, but it's still all of a sudden the majority of their paper were around COVID. And also other topics like physics and society and computer science, the social information and network category got a significant fraction of COVID-related paper. So that meant that we had to do something about it, and we cannot just ignore it. So in general, so this is the distribution of the COVID-related submission for all the categories that we have in arXiv. And in general, I think arXiv is a good home for those type of research, basically because we offer a faster turnaround time. In 24 hours, usually you will have the paper available online, so it is very easy to get quick feedback from other researchers. It has a broad reach. It has a timestamp for authorship. So if you publish then in a journal afterwards, you will know that that person was the author of the paper for the first time. And so it is in a way really a good home for COVID-related research papers. But as Alison mentioned, there are also some problems because arXiv has been developing mostly in physics, computer science, mathematics, and we are expanding a little bit in other topics, but those topics are still representing a minority of the general submissions. So we don't have the same infrastructure in terms of volunteers and experts that could help us. And in something like COVID, this is particularly important because there is a potential of a great risk of misinformation being spread. So it was really important for us to address this issue heads on. And so what we did was that we hired a postdoc from Cornell University. He's an expert in biomedicine, and he has the right expertise to really judge those articles more with more knowledge. And so what he has been doing is that has been screening every submission around COVID for potentially misleading content. And also the interesting part that I think is to be noticed for arXiv is that a lot of the papers around COVID that we received have not been written by biologists, but they have been written by physicists, mathematicians, or computer scientists that realized that this topic was so hot and important right now that they wanted to contribute as well. So they did things like analytical studies or models for spreads and epidemiology. So in that sense, arXiv has almost needed to step up for supporting these various communities to be able to communicate and talk together and put in touch all these physicists and mathematicians with biologists and doctors, so that this information could be shared in a constructive manner. The problem with what we have seen is that we still don't know much about the long-term effects of this pandemic on arXiv, both from a content perspective, but also from an organizational perspective. We don't know when we will be able to grow the size of arXiv. We wanted to hire more people and like grow as an organization. We wanted to grow the number of members that we have and work with universities in different areas of the world. And also we don't even know for sure if current members can really maintain a commitment in the long term, because their finances are under risk in arXiv during this period of time. So all these things are things that at the moment we still don't know, and we are trying to address them from a really community perspective. So we are talking with our members, and we are trying to ensure that we can at least maintain the current service level and wait for a happier time to grow further. But it's definitely a challenge. And in fact, I might maybe take the opportunity to say that this week, that is Open Access Week, it's also the Giving Week for arXiv. So we are actually reaching out to the entire users and community of arXiv for help. And yeah, so there is a link here if anyone wants to contribute, or also just contact us to learn more about how to become a member and how to contribute with arXiv in any other form and way. This was my slides.
Thanks, Eleonora. John, let's turn to you and hear more about the nitty-gritty. How did you handle the influx of papers, and how did it change how the way that bioRxiv and medRxiv had been working?
Sure, that was very interesting from Eleonora. Let me share my screen here and see if that works as it did before. So I skipped over just a couple of the early slides. I should have said, relevant to what Eleonora just mentioned about the funding issues, bioRxiv was very fortunate to gain grant support from the Chan Zuckerberg initiative in 2017, in addition to the funding that we get from Cold Spring Harbor. And that is helping us grow and expand and provide the resources that we have needed during this period of growth. medRxiv also received support from the same source, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, in June of this year. So relevant to the challenges, several things I wanted to mention. One was that as far as we were concerned, the pandemic issues began in the middle of January. The science of the virus, I guess, began with its identification as the cause of COVID-19 on January the 7th, and the sequence of the virus was reported on January the 10th. The first paper on the virus appeared on bioRxiv on January the 19th. And between then and the end of January, there were 30 papers that characterized the virus and its receptor, and there were models of its transmission. One of those papers claimed that there were inserts in the spike protein that resembled protein sequences from HIV-1, and there was a storm of criticism about the technical issues in the paper. But, and in fact, such a storm of criticism that the paper was withdrawn by the authors within a couple of days. But we also noticed during that weekend that the paper had been picked up by conspiracy-oriented websites who were discussing the possibility that the virus had been human engineered. So we decided to put up that weekend, an additional caveat about the use of preprints, a large yellow banner that reminded readers that these were preprints, and among other things, they should not be reported in news media as established information. We also decided that we were going to augment our screening process. On bioRxiv, and on medRxiv, we have a two-step scrutiny of every paper, one by the in-house team who look at a variety of things, and then by a group of 170 principal investigators with different specialties and different geographic locations. So we were very fortunate to be able to recruit an additional group of outbreak science experts who became affiliates specifically so that we could go to them with particular papers and ask for their guidance. And we've been enormously benefited by having that particular group. And as the weeks of the pandemic went on and the numbers of papers rose, so we realized we had to adapt our screening processes as well. So in black on this slide, you can see the issues that are part of our normal non-COVID screening. So the general criteria include, is this really science? Is it a research paper? Has it been plagiarized? And so on. Are there concerns about ethics? On medRxiv, has an appropriate medical ethical approval or waiver been given? Are there issues about patient identity and clinical trial registration? But in it, and on the other side, and under the sort of do no harm category, we have always looked out for things that would cause harm to the public should they turn out to be wrong. So those things might include questions about drug safety or vaccine safety, how diseases are transmitted, toxicity, carcinogenicity, and so on. But in addition, we instituted extra checks, recognizing that there was going to be increased public attention to this content. We looked for papers, such as the kind of paper that Eleonora referred to, written by someone who was not an epidemiologist, but who modeled publicly available data without necessarily conducting research and without having methods and results as a consequence. And we decided that we got a lot of those papers, and we decided we would not post any of them. Also, on the other side of this slide, you see therapy prediction based solely on in silico work. We got a lot of those kinds of papers as well, and again decided on the basis of not wanting to create false expectations. We decided we would not post papers that were solely in silico. There had to be further investigations of some kind. And we also were very wary of any therapeutic claims that were based on retrospective analysis and claimed to show that something had caused improvement in the clinical state of a patient. And part of this was an awareness of the fact that in all the furor about hydroxychloroquine, for example, the run on the drug was such that patients who really needed hydroxychloroquine were denied access to it. And we were very conscious of not wanting to add to that problem or create another similar problem. So those were just, some of the adaptations that we needed to make to our procedures, and most of those concerns, most of those screening criteria remain in effect even this month, this far into the pandemic. Over back to you, Alison.
Thanks, John. Sebastian, so now we've heard a bit about like the just the sheer quantity of papers coming in and how they've been screened to go online, and I'd like to hear more from you about how how people actually find what they want to read, and if what Semantic Scholar did to address that.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I will give just a, okay, I pressed the wrong button, 1 second. Yeah, I think the main, I'll start by giving a quick overview of what we do at Semantic Scholar, just to set some additional context. We are fully funded by the late Paul Allen's estate, and our mission is AI for the common good. And our primary goal from that perspective is to make research, make our research publicly available, and we have a number of projects at the Ellen Institute, including Semantic Scholar, that are focused on different areas. I'll cover briefly what we do at Semantic Scholar to highlight the type of features that we build to empower scholars and researchers to find papers that are relevant to them. As I said earlier, we are an AI-powered research tool for scientific literature. We have about 192 million papers at this point, and we extract meaning and identify connections from within papers and then surface those insights on our website, semanticscholar.org. And our journey, we started about 5 years ago just in computer science because that was our primary expertise. And at that point, we partnered with arXiv, and since then we've expanded to cover all scientific domains. And most recently, earlier this year, we also partnered closely with medRxiv and bioRxiv to index their content in Semantic Scholar. And some key features that we provide to users to find papers that are relevant to them. We have a detailed citation graph that users can use to identify connections between papers. We also surface recommendations. We have search pages, author pages, and supplemental content. We link to clinical trials. We link to code libraries. We link to videos, all with the goal to help scholars put the paper in context and understand what the paper is about. And we also have a few features that help users stay up to date, like email alerts and adaptive research feed, which also works with COVID-19 papers. But since we're talking about how open access has helped us address the COVID-19 pandemic, I'll talk a little bit more detail about a project that we embarked on in early March as soon as the COVID-19 was declared a pandemic. We got to working on a data set called COVID-19, the COVID-19 Open Research Data Set. And this was in partnership with a whole bunch of organizations. Not all of them are listed here, but we worked with arXiv, bioRxiv, medRxiv, a lot of publishers, the National Library of Medicine. And our goal was to create a data set of open access, machine readable COVID-19 related research. We wanted to take all the research that had been published about COVID-19 and coronaviruses in general. So going back all the way to the 1960s, 1970s, when initial research about coronavirus started getting published. And we wanted to make that available in a machine readable format. And we started and got that out very early, within about a week, on March 16th, and have since moved to daily updates. When we first got started, the dataset contained 29,000 papers, and now we're up to more than 280,000 papers. So you can see how much research has been published since March. It's been absolutely incredible. And one of the great driving forces behind making the data, all of the content available, was that a lot of the scientific publishers and preprint servers banded together to make COVID-19 related research open access, which was a very important component to making this research available to scientists who wanted to analyze the entire universe of coronavirus related research. Why did we create this data set? One of the things that quickly became apparent is that PDFs are not suitable for text mining, and we also ran into the challenge, as I said earlier, a number of not a lot of papers aren't open access, and paper metadata is not standardized. So we created a data set that is both comprehensive, includes published research, preprints from multiple sources. It's up to date. We have harmonized metadata. We can clearly show where the research was published. We have full text available where possible, and we also parse data from tables. A lot of the results are contained in tables, and making that available in the machine readable form was another major contribution, and that was done in partnership with IBM. And why did we do this? One of the challenges with keeping up with all the published research, especially if at the growing rate of publications we're seeing with COVID-19 research, is that the answer to specific questions is often contained in the full text. And if you're a scholar and a researcher, finding those answers quickly is a challenge. It's easy to become overwhelmed. And having a data set that's machine readable in a standardized format makes it a lot easier to identify questions, answers to questions about COVID-19. In this case, this example is about hypertension and whether or not it increases the risk associated with COVID-19. And it happens to be in this paper, the answer is in the full text and in a number of tables. So providing that content was in a machine readable form was extremely helpful. In terms of the impact, I won't cover just some of the highlights. The data set was used in a Kaggle challenge. Kaggle is a machine learning challenge platform that's owned by Google. It became one of the most popular machine learning challenges ever. And the primary goal there was to answer questions about COVID-19, including therapeutics and characteristics of the virus, et cetera. And it was very successful in coming up with a number of formats and literature review approaches to help scholars come up with answers to these types of questions. It was also used in a Trek COVID shared task with a focus on improving search relevance for biomedical research questions. It was used in a number of clinical settings. There's some sample quotes on the right in terms of how clinicians have used the data set. And then it's also been used in published research. And I'd like to thank bioRxiv, medRxiv, and arXiv for the partnership here. It wouldn't have been possible to create the data set without participation from preprint servers and also the scientific publishing community. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Alison.
Thanks. Yeah, I think what you brought up there about collaboration is sort of a silver lining in this, is that the pandemic provided an opportunity for collaboration. Eleonora, I was wondering if you could tell us more about why arXiv wants to be involved in these kinds of collaborations.
Yeah, so I think that is basically one of the main points of arXiv mission is really to provide the tools to researchers to build a community and to interact with each other in a fast and constructive way. So these examples of things like what Sebastian have just described is the perfect example of how we want arXiv to be used, basically. So we want authors to be able to share their knowledge as quickly as possible and others to benefit from it in the most interactive way.
And John, would you like to add to that?
Well, I would echo everything that Eleonora just said. We wanted right from the beginning of bioRxiv to be able to generate machine readable content. That is a significant expense. One of the great benefits of our funding from CZI was that allowed us to start the routine conversion of all content and provide full text online, but also a repository of XML from all bioRxiv manuscripts. Which is, I think, Sebastian, the resource that was used to create the COVID-19 data set. And I'm very pleased to say that last week we actually announced the beginning of the availability of full text HTML for every medRxiv paper as well. And the next step in that process will be the construction of a similar repository of medRxiv XML too. So these days, machine readability is an absolute necessity, and we're very delighted to be able to add to the usability of the data set.
Sebastian, I was wondering if this leads into sort of just what the challenges are with this project. Are they technical challenges? Are they coordination challenges? Like what did you find to be the greatest challenges, and how did your team deal with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of there are a few challenges with creating a high quality data set of this size. One is scientific publications are published and made available in many different places. For example, PubMed now has preprints, and preprints are also obviously available in arXiv, bioRxiv, medRxiv. Harmonizing all of that content and making sure that we are disambiguating, deduplicating, and providing clean output data with clear provenance and links back to the original source. That was probably the biggest challenge in creating the data set. That's where most of the effort went into. And then the other thing we needed to do, and this goes back to dealing with things like retractions and papers being pulled back after they have been published, is to make sure that we had a process in place to then have regular updates so that the data set reflected the current state of the research and was continuously updated with all the research that was available. Those are kind of the biggest challenges. And then I would say the last challenge was getting access to as much content as possible. With the pandemic, there was it was great to see a lot of scientific publishers come together and make their content openly available. But half of the content in the data set still isn't available as open access content. We only have metadata records for those papers. In an ideal world, having all of that content available as open access could significantly speed up scientific progress. And we still have a ways to go. And the other example along those lines is foreign language content. There's a lot of the content that we have in our data set is mostly in English. We do have some foreign language content, but that does leave out a lot of published research that's just not openly available, and having that content be included in the data set would have been great.
Eleonora, what would you say the biggest challenges for arXiv were?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, one of the biggest challenge was just stepping up to this need that is something that we didn't really address before. So it's arXiv has been focusing mostly on other topics that were not so close to biology and this type of research. So this really showed us that there is, even though there are other archives like bioRxiv and medRxiv, we know that users want to have a central place where to find information and where to be able to share. And so both of the collaboration with bioRxiv, with Semantic Scholar, and at the same time acknowledging that we also need to address this need from our own community was something that became evident very quickly, and we had to address very quickly.
John, you had mentioned that there was suddenly public interest in some of the work, and that could lead to challenges. I was wondering if you could take a sort of a step back and just help the audience who may or may not know a lot about preprints, like how preprints fit into the scholarly communications landscape, and how you see bioRxiv or medRxiv's role in making that place clear.
Yes, I could certainly take a stab at that. So that's actually relevant to two of the sort of challenges that I was thinking about. And maybe if you wouldn't mind, I could share my screen one more time, just
Absolutely.
to put some numbers to this. I don't know if you can you, I hope you can see that. So let's take medRxiv as the example. So it began in June of 2019, and it grew very nicely, but we were not expecting a large amount of take up, because medicine is a conservative discipline, and preprints were very unfamiliar to many people in medical research. So we got to January, and in January of 2020, medRxiv had about 220 papers submitted on all topics, no COVID papers at all. The next month, it got 200 COVID papers, and each month until May, that volume doubled. So you can see the volume increase here. It is now calming down a bit, thank goodness. But that was a tremendous pressure on the staff, who all rose to the occasion incredibly. We couldn't increase the in-house team because we just didn't have time to find people and train them to do it. So the in-house team that was dealing with pre-pandemic preprints had to deal with what was happening in the middle of the pandemic. And the numbers for bioRxiv are smaller, and the proportion of the whole is smaller, but nevertheless, it was an additional burden. So to answer your question, the first point I'd make is that one of the things that has happened is that this idea of sharing research as soon as you, the author, is ready to share it, has become a much more familiar concept to a much larger proportion of the communities that our servers address. And that was, it was unfamiliar in biomedicine, but over 7 years has become much more so. And now the conversation is beginning to evolve into, well, what happens after preprints become a much more central component in the communication of science. We have a slide which we typically show, but I haven't put it into this deck, showing, bioRxiv at the center of an information universe with lots of things happening around the outside. And this is a development that's already happened with arXiv, with the development of overlay journals and so on. And we imagine that that's a direction that we may see in biomedicine as well. But the point you were making about how have preprints changed in the minds of biomedical researchers, well, I think for many, that is one way in which it has changed, that it's now a legitimate step in the journey of a report on research from its origin to a published journal paper. In fact, for some people, that paper may not make the full journey to a journal because they are quite happy to have it on a preprint server. And I think we may have seen quite a bit more of that in the pandemic as well, because at least some of the reports that were posted in the early days of the pandemic were what I always call reports from the front lines. And they were accounts of a particular community's response or a particular modality of treatment, which by its nature that report was going to become outdated fairly quickly. The second point I would make, which is also relevant to the question you asked, is another challenge that we experienced, which was the question of dealing with the media. As I said, preprints in biomedicine were new, and even experienced journalists on a biomedical beat were uncertain about how to cover them. And in the pandemic, this became a much more critical issue because, of course, preprints represented, new results, often a year or two before they actually would be destined to appear in a journal. So we had to keep emphasizing this caveat about the fact that these were preliminary reports. But it was necessary for journalists to report on them. And I think one consequence of what happened was, first of all, we talked to journalists, we were on panels, we provided advice in this discussion, which still goes on, about how preprint should be covered in the media. And I actually contributed to a tip sheet, which made several of these points. But the most important point, I think, and the most interesting one, is this wonderful quote from Ed Yong, who described science as a slow, erratic stumble towards ever less uncertainty. And this is so different to how many people in the public, amongst the public, believe science works. They see it as a series of dramatic breakthroughs by brilliant individuals. And those of us within science know it isn't like that. So I think that maybe one other consequence of what we've all experienced this year is that there'll be a little bit more understanding from the public about how science really works, and science has become more transparent as a result. And although I know there are concerns about that, but I think on the whole, that has to be a good thing.
Thank you. That's a great quote. I like that.
It is.
So we only have a few minutes left, but I want to just turn to the future. What do you think the pandemic has revealed about the future of open science and open access and its role, not just in this pandemic, but through the future? And Eleonora, we can start with you for that one.
Okay, so yeah, I think what John said makes a lot of sense and applies also to the future. So this experience definitely taught us that increased transparency in science, it's something that we need to really work for and to cherish for the future. It's an important aspect to it. It's taking away the choice of trusting something is not a good approach. What we should do instead is give the context and empower people to understand what they can trust and why they can trust it. So the approaches that John described in terms of explaining that there isn't a peer review in preprints, explaining how you should talk about preprints and science in general in the press. It's things that are essential. And I think that the preprints can play a very important role in the future, exactly doing that, trying to empower people to understand the value of science and how science works in order to be able to be more critical in the way they think and how they read about news and about everything. So I am really hoping that transparency will be the future.
Sebastian?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, when it comes to scientific search and discovery, and this was kind of talked about, both John and Eleonora hit on this as well, is with scientific content becoming papers and content and data becoming available more quickly and more openly than ever, it is important to prevent misinformation. And in terms of what that means from an artificial intelligence perspective is to really invest in what we call responsible AI and responsible data. So as we invest in improving the AI capabilities of Semantic Scholar and help users and scholars understand research, either a paper on its own or research in context, we need to do so responsibly. We don't want to lead researchers down the wrong path. We also want to avoid having researchers draw the wrong conclusions, and that requires investing in explainable AI and providing users with transparent insights into why something is recommended to them, for example, or why they're seeing a certain connection that we've established between two research papers on the website. And that is really one of our big focus areas within Semantic Scholar as we continue to invest in building out our search and discovery experience.
Thanks. And John, do you have more to add?
Well, I think to your point about what has the pandemic done for open science and open access, I think what it has done is to accelerate the pace of something that was happening already, which was a transition towards open access, away from walled garden to content. And that transition has been happening over, is it 20 years now? But in the last 5 years or so, maybe a little longer, the momentum has increased. And I think the conversation within science publishing as an industry is now much less about whether open access is a good thing, but much more about the fact that it is an inevitable thing, and how do we get there in a financially sustainable way. And there is a great deal of discussion and argument and experimentation going on about that particular process. But I think I felt for many years now that open access is inevitable. And I think there are pathways opening up. It may not look the same as it does now, but I think in another 10 years, we will not have content that is concealed from the public gaze by subscriptions and so on. And I think that will be a great thing, because I think society will be benefiting more from science. And I think people who have a real vested interest in understanding, say, a disease or a syndrome, will be enormously benefited, and they will have added trust in the practitioners of science and medicine because they can see what they're doing and get access to those data sets. and that information. So I think it's all been, I wish to goodness we have not had to experience this, but if there's any kind of small silver lining in the pandemic, maybe this kind of progress in science is one of them.
Thanks. So a question actually just came in on the chat for you, Sebastian. Can you comment on the availability of papers in languages other than English on preprint servers and whether they're included in Semantic Scholar? You did mention that a little bit, but maybe some more detail.
Yeah. In terms of non-English language papers, I would say that the coverage is pretty sparse for the most part. The majority of scientific research continues to be published in English. When papers are published in a foreign language and made available on a preprint server or on PubMed or via a publisher that we have an indexing and licensing agreement with, we do make it available in Semantic Scholar. But for example, if you look at the volume of research that's published out of China, that represents, I think, about 30 to 40% of all published research, and that content is currently mostly absent on our side because that content just isn't available for indexing. So there are a lot of challenges that remain from that perspective.
Thanks. Well, we're basically at time, so I just want to thank all of you for participating as panelists. I learned a lot, and I know our audience did too. And before all the participants leave, I want to thank you for being here too, and bring your attention to a second event hosted by Cornell for Open Access Week, and that is a panel discussion on building equity in education with open education resources, and that will be held on Thursday. And you can find the details at events.cornell.edu. Also throughout the week, this is International Open Access Week, and you can find virtual events hosted around the world by following the Twitter hashtag OAWeek. So thank you all so much. Any last words?
Just thank you for me for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to Eleonora and Sebastian again, and it has been, for me, educational and instructive too. So thank you for letting me be part of it.
Great.
Yeah, same for me. And I hope that this is a good opportunity also for just all our organizations to do more things together. I think it's always fun to do and useful for people.
Agree. Thank you so much. And it's definitely exciting to have this conversation as part of Open Access Week.
Thanks. Yeah, and this has been recorded and it will be posted definitely by the end of the week, and we will share that on our on Twitter. So so those of you who want to share it with others who couldn't be here, you can do that. So thanks again. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.